Blow tells the story of fast money, power, and downfall. But the real life of George Jung goes deeper than Hollywood. What started as a small-time hustle turned into a connection with the Medellín Cartel, placing Jung at the center of the cocaine explosion in America. At his peak, he was moving massive amounts of cocaine into the U.S., working alongside figures like Carlos Lehder and operating in the same world as Pablo Escobar. The money was endless, the lifestyle unmatched, but it came with constant risk, betrayal, and pressure from law enforcement. This isn't just a story about drugs, it's about ambition and consequences. Because for every high, there's a fall, and Boston George Jung's fall would cost him everything. Health Wealth Diary presents the real story behind the movie, Blow. George Jung was born on August 6, 1942, in Boston, but it was in the quieter, more grounded town of Weymouth where his identity was shaped. This wasn't a glamorous upbringing. No privilege, no shortcuts. Just a blue-collar household trying to survive in post-war America. His father, Fred Jung, was a hard-working man who owned a small plumbing business. He believed in discipline, responsibility, and the idea that an honest day's work would eventually pay off. But reality didn't cooperate. The business struggled constantly, weighed down by debt, bad luck, and the kind of financial pressure that slowly breaks a man's spirit. There's a defining moment in the film where Fred, worn down by failure, tells his son something along the lines of, "Money isn't real." To Fred, it was a lesson about values, that integrity matters more than wealth. But George didn't hear it that way. He saw something else entirely, a man who did everything right and still lost. In school, George wasn't known for academics. He wasn't the smartest kid in the room, but he didn't need to be. What he had was social intelligence. He was confident, likable, and able to read people quickly. These are traits that don't show up on report cards, but they're invaluable in the world he would later enter. As he got older, image started to matter more. George wanted to look successful before he actually was. Nice clothes, attention, and respect. That created pressure, and instead of motivating him toward discipline, it pushed him toward shortcuts. He wasn't thinking about long-term careers, he was thinking about how to get ahead fast. After high school, he briefly attended the University of Southern Mississippi, but it didn't last. College represented structure, patience, and delayed success, everything he wasn't interested in. He drifted, skipped classes, and eventually dropped out. By that point, his mindset was already clear. He wasn't going to follow the traditional path. By the time George left college, the foundation was already set. But the real turning point came in the late 1960s, when timing, location, and mindset finally aligned. After college, he began casually using marijuana. At first, it wasn't about building an empire, it was practical. He would buy weed, sell a portion of it, and use the profits to cover his own supply. No grand plan yet, just a simple hustle. But even in that small setup, something clicked. There was money and movement. In 1967, after reconnecting with a childhood friend, George had the realization that changed everything. Marijuana was cheap and easy to find in California, but back in New England, especially around Boston, it was scarce and expensive. That gap meant one thing: pure profit. At first, the operation was simple. He used his girlfriend, a flight attendant, to transport marijuana in suitcases across commercial flights. Low risk, high reward. But George wasn't built to stay small. He quickly expanded, moving from personal smuggling to organized transport. Soon, he was flying in marijuana directly from Puerto Vallarta, scaling the operation far beyond what most dealers were doing at the time. He began using stolen planes from private airfields, particularly around Cape Cod, and hired professional pilots to move large quantities across borders. This wasn't street dealing anymore, this was infrastructure. At the peak of this operation, Jung and his crew were reportedly making around $250,000 a month, millions in today's money. For a kid who grew up watching his father struggle, this wasn't just success, it was validation. He had beaten the system his father couldn't. But the higher the climb, the harder the fall. In 1974, everything caught up with him. George was arrested in Chicago after being caught with 660 pounds of marijuana. At the time, he was staying at the Playboy Club, waiting to complete a deal. but the connection he was supposed to meet had already been arrested on separate charges and gave George up to authorities in exchange for a lighter sentence. Just like that, the operation collapsed. During sentencing, George reportedly argued with the judge, questioning why he was being imprisoned for crossing an imaginary line with a bunch of plants. It didn't matter. He was sentenced and sent to Federal Correctional Institution, Danbury. On the surface, it looked like the end of his empire, but in reality, this is where the story actually begins to evolve. While serving time at Danbury, George met Carlos Lehder, a young and ambitious trafficker who would later become deeply connected to the Medellín Cartel. This meeting is often dramatized, but the core truth holds. George brought something valuable to the table: knowledge of smuggling logistics, especially aviation, how to acquire planes, coordinate drops, and move product efficiently. Lehder brought something even bigger: access to Colombia's emerging cocaine trade. At this point in history, cocaine wasn't yet the dominant drug in America, but it was close. The demand was growing, and the infrastructure wasn't fully built yet. Together, they saw the next level. However, here's where reality differs from the movie narrative. George's role remained primarily logistical and short-term, as Lehder expanded, eventually building a major smuggling base in the Bahamas. He moved deeper into cartel structures. George did not follow that same path. Their partnership eventually ended, and George remained more of an independent smuggler rather than a central cartel figure. There's also no verified evidence that George ever worked directly with Pablo Escobar. That part of the story has largely been amplified over time, especially after Blow popularized his image. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the United States was entering a new era, one defined by excess, speed, and a drug that quickly became a symbol of both: cocaine. Behind that surge was a growing, highly organized supply chain, dominated by powerful networks like the Medellín Cartel. They controlled production, international transport, and wholesale distribution. By this point, the game had evolved far beyond the independent smuggling operations of the early 1970s. Despite how Blow portrays it, Boston George Jung was not at the center of this explosion. He wasn't controlling supply, and he wasn't directing cartel operations. His earlier involvement with Carlos Lehder placed him near the beginnings of this shift, but by the time cocaine truly took over America, George was no longer a major player in shaping the system. The infrastructure had scaled beyond individuals like him. Trafficking routes were more secure, more violent, and more tightly controlled. Entire organizations now handled what once required small crews and independent operators. The stakes were higher, and the margin for error was smaller. At the same time, law enforcement began responding with equal intensity. Federal agencies increased surveillance, launched coordinated operations, and began targeting not just dealers, but entire networks. The era of loose, opportunistic smuggling was over. Mirtha Calderón was born in Cuba in 1952. She grew up in a low-income environment shaped by political and economic instability after the Cuban Revolution. While her family struggled financially like many others at the time, she still managed to perform well in school and showed academic strength. After relocating to the United States and settling in California, Mirtha worked normal low-income jobs, including waitressing at a local diner. At this stage, her life was stable but limited, far from the criminal world she would later enter. But everything changed in 1975, when she met George Jung. George was already involved in cocaine trafficking and linked to the Medellín Cartel. Their relationship developed quickly, driven as much by lifestyle attraction as emotional connection. Mirtha was drawn into George's world almost immediately. By 1977, they were married, and her life shifted into the center of the cocaine trade. She was exposed to large amounts of drug money, constant travel, and an environment where illegal operations were normal daily activity. She participated in aspects of trafficking, including travel logistics and communication within the network. The lifestyle appeared luxurious: expensive clothing, money without limits, and constant movement. But underneath it was unstable and dangerous, with law enforcement pressure always increasing. Over time, cocaine use became central in their environment. What began as exposure turned into dependency. Mirtha developed a serious addiction, and George also struggled heavily with the drug. Their relationship became defined by a cycle of drug use, money flow, and emotional instability. Even during her pregnancy with their daughter, Kristina "Sunshine" Jung, drug use continued, showing how deeply addiction had overtaken their lives. By the early 1980s, the world around George and Mirtha Jung was collapsing under pressure. The DEA and other agencies were tightening surveillance across smuggling routes, financial flows, and known associates. It was only a matter of time before their home was raided and both George and Mirtha were arrested. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Mirtha made the decision to provide information to law enforcement about people connected to the drug trade, including aspects of George's network. Her cooperation wasn't about power or revenge. It was about survival and reducing her own legal consequences. When Mirtha was released in 1981, she didn't return to the same life. She walked away from the drug trade completely. Their divorce followed in 1984, officially ending the relationship that had been built inside the cocaine era. What remained between them was no longer partnership or lifestyle, it was distance, consequence, and the shared damage of what they had lived through together. In Blow, Mirtha is played by Penelope Cruz, who portrayed her as intense, emotional, and heavily addicted, with her relationship to George, played by the incredible Johnny Depp, defined almost entirely by chaos, arguments, and drug use. The film emphasizes volatility. That part is grounded in truth. Addiction did play a major role in their relationship, and their home life was unstable. However, the movie compresses and simplifies her role. In reality, Mirtha was more than just a chaotic partner. She was actively involved in aspects of the drug operation, including travel and communication within the network. The film hints at this, but mostly keeps the focus on George, reducing her role to emotional impact rather than operational involvement. Where the biggest difference comes in is her transformation. In real life, Mirtha's arrest and prison time became a turning point. She got sober during incarceration and made a permanent decision to leave the drug world after her release. That long-term recovery, decades of sobriety, and complete separation from crime is barely explored in Blow. The film keeps her tied to the drug-filled violence and doesn't fully show that she actually escaped the life. After his release, Boston George didn't slow down. He went all in. With no family structure left and nothing grounding him, he leaned completely into the life that had already started consuming everything around him. In 1987, George was arrested again after months of investigation. It wasn't a dramatic takedown, it was calculated and inevitable. There was enough evidence to bring serious charges, and for the first time in years, the momentum was no longer his. The system had him locked in. What followed was something that defined this phase of his life: cooperation. Boston George was offered a deal to testify against Carlos Lehder. At first, he resisted. In that world, telling on someone came with consequences, especially with names connected to powerful figures. But the situation shifted when Carlos himself began cooperating with authorities and Pablo Escobar wanted him gone. At that point, loyalty no longer meant protection. He testified. That decision reduced his sentence, but it also marked the final collapse of the world he had built. By the early 1990s, George Jung was free again, but he wasn't the same figure he had been in the peak cocaine years. The empire was gone, the connections were weaker, and the system had completely changed. But the one thing that hadn't changed was him. He was still chasing it. After his earlier arrest and cooperation against Carlos Lehder, George had a chance to walk away for good. The money was gone, but he was free. He could have rebuilt a normal life, stayed out of trouble, and avoided what was coming next. Around the same time, he also tried to reconnect with his daughter, Kristina "Sunshine" Jung, but his separation from Mirtha would prove challenging. George tried to be in her life, but Mirtha was only chasing child support. Lack of money meant he can't see his daughter, so George was left with only one choice: get back in the game. The film does depict this moment in his life accurately. However, it does not stress the fact that Mirtha demanded she receive child support if he was to see Kristina, which was the driving force for him getting back into the cocaine trade. In 1994, Boston George went back into the drug business, this time on a smaller scale, without the power or protection he once had, and that decision sealed everything. He was arrested in Topeka with 1,754 pounds of cocaine. This wasn't a minor case, it was massive federal weight, the kind that guarantees decades behind bars. There was no room left for maneuvering, no real way out. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of conspiracy. The sentence, 60 years in federal prison. The sentence wasn't just about time. It meant missing the rest of his life outside. It meant losing any chance to repair what was broken with his daughter. It meant watching the world move on without him. And unlike before, there was no quick return. This wasn't months or a few years. This was decades. Boston George eventually cooperated again, providing testimony that helped reduce his sentence to around 20 years. On paper, it looked like a break. In reality, it didn't change much. He was still going to spend a huge portion of his life behind bars. The damage was already done. After his 1994 arrest and conviction, George was moved through multiple federal facilities, eventually serving years in places like Federal Correctional Institution Fort Dix and Federal Correctional Institution La Tuna. By this point, the outside world had moved on. The cocaine era that defined his rise was over, and the networks he once operated in had either evolved or collapsed. But something unexpected happened while he was locked up. His story started growing. In 2001, the film Blow was released, starring Johnny Depp, based on the book by Bruce Porter. The movie told a dramatized version of his life, from small-time marijuana dealer to high-level cocaine smuggler. And just like that, Boston George became a legend. The film brought his story to a global audience, turning him into a pop culture figure while he was still sitting in a prison cell. People weren't just hearing about him, they were watching his life play out on screen, with all the highs, lows, and emotion packaged into a cinematic narrative. But there was a gap between movie and reality. The film amplified certain parts, the rise, the relationship with his wife, the connection to cartel figures, and simplified others. It leaned into the myth, the idea of a smuggler who lived fast, made millions, and became part of something bigger than himself. What it didn't fully show was the aftermath, the decades in prison, the missed life, the reality of aging behind bars. After nearly 20 years in prison, George Jung was finally released early on June 2, 2014. It marked the end of one of the longest chapters of his life. But freedom didn't mean a fresh start. He was older. The world was different. The life he once knew was gone. And although he was out, the consequences of his past were permanent, especially when it came to relationships, including the one with his daughter, Kristina "Sunshine" Jung. He was briefly arrested again in 2016 for violating probation, but it didn't lead to another long sentence. After that, he stayed out. For the first time in decades, he was truly done with the system. In his later years, George lived relatively quietly, occasionally appearing in interviews and public events, largely because of the renewed attention brought by the movie and his close friendship to Johnny Depp. But physically, his health was declining. George suffered from serious liver and kidney issues in his final years. His body, after decades of stress, substance use, and aging, was beginning to shut down. Eventually, he was placed under hospice care at his home in Weymouth, the same place where his life had begun. On May 5, 2021, George Jung died at the age of 78. There was no violence, no dramatic ending, no final deal gone wrong, just the long-term consequences catching up to an old man. After the divorce in 1984, Mirtha Jung focused on staying clean and rebuilding a stable life. Unlike most people tied to that era, she maintained long-term sobriety for decades. She kept a low profile, no major media presence, no interviews, and lived quietly in the US, working normal jobs and later pursuing interests like writing. As an adult, Kristina "Sunshine" Jung built her own path. She's been involved in small business ventures, including a clothing line tied to the Boston George brand, and has at times spoken about telling her side of the story. There were periods where she and George tried to reconnect after his release in 2014, but the relationship was complicated and not fully repaired. In 2020, Carlos Lehder was released and deported to Germany due to his citizenship. After spending over 30 years locked up, he walked free, but far removed from the world he once helped build. In Blow, Carlos is not shown as himself. Instead, his role is largely transformed into the character Diego Delgado. After his release, Carlos Lehder has kept a low profile and stayed out of the spotlight. He hasn't returned to crime, making only occasional podcast appearances where he reflects on his past in drug trafficking. and shares stories about his time working with Boston George. In Blow, Tuna is portrayed as George Jung's loyal best friend, his marijuana-era partner who eventually fades out of the story. He's played by Ethan Suplee, and in the film, his ending is left vague, almost like he just disappears from George's life. In real life, the character is based on a close friend named Waino Tuminen, aka Tuna, who actually did not disappear. Unlike George, Tuna eventually stepped away from the drug world and chose a quieter, more stable life. Over the years, the two reconnected after George's release from prison. Tuna has occasionally appeared in interviews, where he talks about their early days in the drug trade and reflects on that period of his life. Blow made George Jung look like a larger-than-life figure. A guy who rode the wave of the cocaine era, made millions, and lived a life most people could never imagine. That part is true, but it's incomplete. The real story of Boston George isn't the rise, it's the pattern. Every time he had a chance to walk away, he went back. After his first arrest, after making money, after losing everything, even after getting out of prison, he kept choosing the same path. Not because he had to, but because he couldn't let go of the life. And that's what the movie doesn't fully show. It simplifies the system he was part of, it compresses timelines, it creates characters and moments to make the story cleaner. It leans into the idea that he was at the center of it all, connected directly to the highest levels, moving the majority of cocaine into the United States. In reality, he was part of something much bigger, a network that evolved beyond him, replaced him, and eventually forgot he even existed. Thank you for watching. What was your favorite scene from Blow? Leave your comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more awesome videos from the Health Wealth Diary.